it is perhaps one of the biggest challenges that governments across the world are facing, companies at their level, even individuals. Cybersecurity is the big buzzword at the moment. As all of us are now living in an increasingly digital world, we're finding ourselves far more vulnerable to cyber attacks, which have repercussions for all of us. There are reports now that the government of India is working on a standalone law for cybersecurity in the country. And we are talking to a panel of terrific experts tonight to try and understand, firstly, what the challenges are that India faces, what challenges we face as individuals, and what does it actually mean to have a standalone law to deal with cybersecurity issues? How is that something that is different from whatever exists in our current setup and our current mechanisms? I'm happy to introduce this evening first Trisha Ray, Associate Fellow for the Center for Security Strategy and Technology with the Observer Research Foundation. Trisha Ray, thank you very much for joining us. Jitin Jain, Director of Voyager InfoSec, one of the country's most well-known cybersecurity experts. Jitin, great to have you with us. Pranesh Prakash is with us, Affiliated Fellow of the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. These are the best voices that you can get on a subject as important as this. So let me get to this straight away. Jitin, if I could ask you first, do you think it's important for India to have a standalone cybersecurity law, which the government is apparently working on? And if so, why?
I think instead of having a separate cybersecurity law, it's better if we amend the existing IT law and completely overhaul it. Because, this piecemeal measures of dealing with the problems, it is almost like firefighting. You're not looking at the solutions of tomorrow. I mean, you take the example of this, intermediary rules which came in, or you take the new social media guidelines where people have been asked to set up offices here. It appears that we are fighting the problems maybe for 2 years or 3 years. But if you look at the overall picture for 15, 20 years, first thing what we really need is a regulator. So we need a law. We should bring in a regulator for the entire digital domain, which shall include fintech, which shall include social media, which shall include cybersecurity, which shall include private companies, and that regulator should be independent of the government in terms of appointment. Also, we should have a multi-stakeholder representation, and then we should have a model where we should impose graded penalties and punishments instead of what we mechanism that if some platform does not comply, like social media platform, which is an intermediary, only power you have is to block it. So if there is a ego battle or for a small thing which they are not complying with, you have no option to impose any penalty or impose any graded punishment like 15 days of block on upboarding new users, or 15-day blockade or a 20-day blockade. All you have is a permanent block. So I think what we need is a regulator, and the regulator should be given enough freedom to frame its own bylaws and SOPs. So far as cybersecurity law is concerned, I think then we are having a separate UAV and drone policy. Very soon we will have a new cybersecurity strategy in place. We already have an IT law. We do not know what happened to the previous cybersecurity policy, which talked about creating 5 lakh professionals in 5 years. It's been 7 years now. We do not even have 5,000. So what happens is that we create a lot of policies, strategies, and law, but there is no way to hold anybody accountable. There is no way to actually, adjust the performance or do any course correction for the next 5-7 years. So in my personal opinion, be it social media challenges, what we are facing, or cybersecurity threats we are facing, or be it the data privacy challenges, which is now, going to be tackled with the data privacy law, I think it would be better in this country if we have a comprehensive reform, which is, guided by both by a law and by a regulator.
All right. Interesting initial thoughts. Pranesh Prakash, how do you see this particular issue? And do you agree with Jitin that we have the mechanisms that are already in place and we just need to work on that? And also, just as a follow-up to that, the word regulation sometimes makes me a bit nervous, because in the times we live in, one wonders, where the lines are crossed between regulation in the traditional sense that we understand it and a breach of our own privacy, which Pegasus has shown is very possible. Pranesh Prakash.
So I think it's useful to think of this in a layered manner. There's the national security issues, which are at the nation state and the government level, which includes all the military, secrets protection, critical infrastructure protection, and so on. There is the protection of enterprises and organizations, and then there are individuals. Now, some of what, for instance, in the past, India has done, things like blocking of TikTok and dozens, more than 4 dozen other apps on national security grounds, there's absolutely no basis for. The government justified it on the one hand by, some people in public mentioned individual privacy as a reason. Now, how that justifies a ban under Section 69A, it's not very clear to me. And others justified it as, and the government in its press release justified it under national security, but declined to provide any details on how it measured a national security threat. And on what basis it said that these 4 dozen apps somehow pose a national security threat. So when we actually tackle or rather the history that we have of tackling these kinds of issues has been sorely lacking in terms of transparency. There are other kinds of cases. For instance, there was last year a report, earlier this year, there was a report of a power plant in Bombay being attacked by outside forces. And there's been no transparency about it. A few years ago, there were reports of ATMs in India having been attacked, yet there was no public disclosure of what extent that attack, how vast was it, what all was affected. There was no actual closure to it. And on one quick note, there's nowhere in the law that a permanent ban or a permanent block is required. It's just provided for, allowed for under Section 69A of the IT Act, but it's not required that any kind of block be permanent. And indeed, TikTok was once banned in 2020 on a temporary basis, and then that was made permanent in 2021. So it's not necessary that bans be permanent. I think more than any law, the policy, the national cybersecurity policy that we have right now, it's very confused and a little bit confusing. It doesn't actually cover all that we need to. If I may just read out some of the organizations that we actually have dealing with this. So under the Prime Minister's office, there's the National Security Council, which is usually headed by the National Security Advisor. There's also the National Information Board, which also the National Security Advisor heads. Under the National Technical Research Organization, there's the NCIIPC, which deals with critical infrastructure and attacks to them. There's also a National Cybersecurity Coordinator who advises the PMO. Under MAIT, there's a different set of apparatus for cybersecurity, including the Computer Emergency Response Team. On the military side, there's yet another set of organizations. So, and nowhere is it clear in any public documentation how these all coordinate with one another. How do they actually cohesively provide any kind of policy framework for India, provide any kind of advice for what India should be doing? So one of the most urgently needed things, at least at that nation state level that I'd mentioned earlier, is some amount of cohesive policy making and some amount of transparency for when attacks do happen and when India does decide to respond through some means or the other. So these are, I think, more urgently needed. The reforms of the IT Act itself, the IT Act, I don't think provides a very elaborate basis for, say, a cyber warfare policy or any such other external threats to Indian cybersecurity. On the internal level, so at the level of, say, data protection, there's Section 43A of the IT Act, which provides a very limited set of data security guidelines, but they've never been used in India. Okay, and that's very sad. And at the enterprise level, and the organizational level, there's a provision for the Computer Emergency Response Team, and that's been there since 2000 IT Act itself. But we need more sectoral and thematic computer emergency response teams, which does not actually need amendment of the IT Act. They just need to be set up as bodies. They don't need to be government sponsored and so on. So that's my kind of opening statement of what all the different pieces that we need.
I see a lot of similarity in what you and Jitin are essentially saying, which is that there's, I mean, we're kind of all over the place when it comes to an issue as important as this. There are perhaps too many players, and as you said, lack of cohesiveness in having a single sort of clear response on this. Trisha, Ray, how do you look at this from your perspective? And firstly, at a government level, what do you think India needs to do, particularly in the Chinese context? I think when it came to the banning of apps, it appeared to clearly have been a more political decision to be seen to be doing something than actually doing something.
Yes, I do want to echo something Pranesh said, which is that this is like a mainstay of regulation, in that a lot of the grounds for government access to data at present are very vague. And that's a vagueness that's present in the PDP draft as well. We don't have very clear like stipulations on what constitutes a threat to national security. And it's not like there aren't models for this. There was, I believe, for example, as part of the consultations that ORF has hosted for the previous draft of the PDP bill, some participants had recommended stating clearly that, say, an impending terrorist attack could be one example, threats to infrastructure could be an example. So there are instances then that need to be stated as grounds then for access. So yes, do want to echo that. Then going back to whether bans are an effective measure, I mean, in the short term, perhaps. And there's no denying that it did send a pretty strong signal. A lot of other countries took notice of India's pretty strong stance on Chinese apps, and that in itself has some value as well, right? Signaling is an important value in foreign policy. But as a long-term measure, no, it's just banning certain vendors, certain providers doesn't solve a very broad and
long-term
pervasive issue that is cybersecurity, that goes all the way down to the individual level, like you stated in the brief, and up to the national level. Yeah.
I just want to get a sense, and let me ask Jitin Jain this question. Jitin, when we look at cyber attacks from hostile countries like, say, China, let's just explain this to people. What does that mean? I mean, what are they capable of doing if they get into our government systems? Is it spyware to look at what top officials might be up to, or what are they potentially capable of? Essentially, your Mike. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, if you look at the nation states, I think eventually there are three different threats we are facing today. If you look at agencies like ISPR of Pakistan, the fundamental threat is about creating public disorder, misinformation campaigns, like instigating riots and spreading fake news and all those things, trying to manipulate elections or trying to create political divisions in the society. If you look at the other two sides of serious threats, which have been there from last 20 odd years, one is disruption. You plant a malware inside a power grid, or you plant a rat inside a terminal of a very critical facility, and probably just leave it there, keep monitoring it, and wait for a day when there is a small military conflict or when there is a border conflict, and that could be used as a precursor of that conflict, or as a force multiplier to create some sort of disruption. Because this is the age of network-centric warfare. You will have radars mounted on IL-76 planes flying in, AWACS planes, then you have drones, and then you have a central command or radar stations guiding your aircrafts and troops. So if that entire network of communication is disrupted by disrupting the power supply or disrupting the telecom network, or by even cutting the undersea cables or optic fiber cables, you can create a huge disruption in the war. And we have seen the examples. You take the example of Israeli aircrafts bombing, Iran and Syria. First thing what they did was take off the radar stations. You see Iran, Russian planes where they've gone around in the Middle East. First thing they target is the radar and any sort of network communication. And this is the age of this network-centric warfare. Now, third threat what we are facing, apart from this disruption, like what happened in Bombay and power grid disruption and all, is espionage, which is the oldest surviving tradition, and cyber has just changed the entire landscape of it. So you hack individuals, you hack institutions, you hack facilities, you steal patents, you steal designs at times to leapfrog the development of an economy, you steal information to create political ruckus, destroy reputations. You sometimes steal money to revive your economy, like what is happening in North Korea, where they've been targeting countries left, right, and center to have some sort of Bitcoin scams or run ransomware programs. So when it comes to espionage and disruption, China is the biggest threat today. So and that is where I disagree with both Risha and Pranesh when they said that probably banning Chinese apps was more of a cosmetic in nature, or government of India was not empowered by law. There is no provisions. See, if you look very carefully and practically in your heart, just 3 months after these Chinese apps were banned, you had a expose led by consortium of newspapers, Indian Express, Guardian, and all, where they exposed a thing called Genova data leaks, you would remember. And it showed the quantum of data China was mining using merely open source intelligence of every important individual, institution, think tank, government institution, press agency across the world. They mine position of every satellite, which is available in open domain. They mine GPS data of every satellite, aircraft, and the ship in place. They mine every research paper published by an institution, the author, the leniency they have had towards China, or if they were critical of it. They mined every single press release published by every single important company in India. They mined every single article written by every journalist in India. They mine data of every single financial aspect of every startup. So this is only open source. And that kind of scale and size have never been seen before. Now, if I walk in the front of your house, it is open source intelligence. I see something. Somebody is going and going out. If I hire 1,000 people who just keep walking every day, where I am able to create some sort of 24-hour visibility, this is called surveillance, open surveillance, which is what China has been doing with the open data. Now, imagine if they had the capability of what they could do with the closed door data. So if we all agreed with the Snowden leaks, if US was using all companies like Facebook, Apple to mine data for surveillance, do you think China is a saint? They would also be doing with the Chinese companies. And these Chinese companies are mandated by Chinese Cloud Act to aid in the intelligence operations of the Communist Party if they're directed to. This is not sharing information, to aid in the intelligence work. Now, what applications were banned? 59 first, if you see the list. First is Weibo. What have they done? They censored all the press releases and the statements of Prime Minister and Embassy of India. We have never seen a sovereign being censored in the times of a conflict. This is China. Number two, Alibaba, which funded, I think, 2,000 crores in UC News. Maybe you come from journalist background. This company claimed to have more than 1,000 journalists. What is the kind of news they were publishing?
We've lost your mic. Sorry.
So
Yeah, it's back.
which women Rahul Gandhi meets every night? This is the kind of news they publish.
Mike. Sorry.
When you click on those links, they tell you please install the UC News or UC browser, which is essentially claimed by any experts across the world as a malware. So if these apps, which are run by private companies, which are forced to have Chinese Communist Party members and committees on board, and an army which is there on your border have killed 40 of your soldiers, which is not a state army, it is a private armed wing of Communist Party. So that party will use every means at their disposal to collect data and use for surveillance during the times of conflict. And that is why that preemptive step of doing away with that digital surveillance was necessary. And as I conclude, Pranesh said there is no power in law. See, if there is an emerging threat to your national security or sovereignty of India, you have elected a government which can deal with that. And suppose if there is absolutely no power in 69A, every country in the world has a sovereign power. And that sovereign power, if government of India decides to choose, it can decide which national will enter in India. They can selectively block certain nationalities from entering in India. They can selectively block certain apps to be, being operated in India. And guess what? Not even a single Chinese company till today has gone to court to oppose the decision. Reason, they themselves have been doing it from last 25 years. So, sure, ulta kotwal ko kahan daale?
I think that's interesting what you said, because you've given us a much wider perspective on this issue of the banning of apps. My question to Pranesh then is that again, when we look at what governments may or may not do in this policy domain, how do we square that off with individual rights, and the protection of our own data, and in the name of national security, one sees a lot of things happening today, which may not really pass scrutiny in normal times. So how do we square off these concerns?
So before I get to that, could I just address some of the concerns raised by Mr. Jain?
Yes.
And because I didn't, just to clarify, I didn't say that India does not have the power to block apps. It very much does under Section 69A. What I mentioned was that it didn't exercise that power judiciously, that it didn't provide reasons for why it was blocking these apps. It didn't make it clear why actually blocking of these apps does in fact fall under 69A. Okay, and none of the reasons mentioned by Mr. Jain don't apply to other kinds of entities, including Twitter, Facebook, all of which have NSA has direct access to. We learned through the Snowden revelations. What Mr. Jain said about China spying on us, I'm sure China is spying on us, but so is the US, so is Pakistan. Boundless Informant, one of the programs run by the NSA, in 2013, it was revealed that India was one of the top targets, okay, along with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. These were the top 3 targets of Boundless Informant, collecting billions of call data records per month. Okay, so to me, it's unclear why any kind of policy that we put in place should be so narrow and myopic, where it targets China and Chinese apps, rather than put in place a general structure that can be applied to all apps, that can be applied to all infrastructure providers. So I don't see why Huawei, for instance, should be singled out, when it is known that in past intelligence scandals that Cisco has provided direct access to US government, that Vodafone was involved in spying on top government officials and the military in Greece. Okay, so that Ericsson has been involved in surveillance as well. So all these all these infrastructure companies, right, are working with different kinds of intelligence agencies. And even if they're not directly working with them, they're definitely being spied upon by these intelligence agencies. So they're being used by intelligence agencies. So what we should be trying to do is to protect Indian national security against all intelligence agencies who aren't working with us. Okay, and it can't come, and we can't actually achieve that by declaring certain countries as, quote unquote, the threat, and banning infrastructure providers from there, banning apps from there, okay, without actually saying why we regard them as somehow being in some way more contaminated or more dangerous than other providers from other countries. So that's point number 1.
Should I wait for Trisha to come in, or can I take 30 seconds to just put
I'll
certain
let
things on the
Pranesh
clock?
finish his point, Jitin, and I'll come back to you. And then Trisha, please be patient. I promise you unfettered speaking time after that. Yes, Pranesh.
And then to answer the question that you raised, I think the data protection law is one part of that, and we very urgently need a law targeting surveillance reform, looking at bringing intelligence agencies under parliamentary oversight and having independent oversight over them as well. Now, this is something that was first floated, as far as I know, in 2010 in India by then Vice President Hamid Ansari. There was a private member's bill that was brought in by Mr. Manish Tiwari for this, but this has never really been an important aspect of Indian national security policy. And I think it's urgently needed. What we've seen time and time again through revelations such as that of Pegasus and others, is that Indian citizens have as much to worry from the Indian state as we have to worry from, quote unquote, external threats such as China and Pakistan and so on. I don't know of an instance where the Chinese government has directly violated my rights, but I do know of instances where the Indian government has violated my rights. And so that is of direct concern to me. And I want that that both of these need to be there. Now, the personal data protection bill has a total security and a very large carve out for investigation, for criminal investigation and so on. Now, that's not a good idea. Okay, what we need is not a complete carve out of the kind that we've seen, but a limited carve out, because very obviously we can't ensure national security and ensure criminal investigations if they're brought within the full framework of data protection laws and of privacy laws. So, but they still need to be accountable. You can't, as a previous Minister of State for the MHA mentioned when I was a part of a panel on privacy principles in 2012. He said that we can't sacrifice privacy in the name of national security, because the very purpose of national security is to ensure that we can enjoy these kinds of rights, such as privacy. So you'd be giving up one of the purposes of national security by completely obliterating privacy, which is what seems to be the case with the current personal data protection bill. And so these two sets of things are very urgently needed. I'd also actually add, we do need reform of the criminal procedure code for investigation, because sections 91 and 92 of the CRPC apply to the world of letters and apply even to an extent to the world of telegrams, but it's to apply to investigations right now, it's just very difficult. And so we need reform there as well when we're talking about.
That's a very good point. Jitin, do you want to quickly respond? And then I'd like to go to Trisha, and I'll come back to you again in just a moment. Yeah, Jitin.
Yeah, so as judicious decision making while banning these apps, you see, let me put it on record. All 59 apps by law which is there, they were sent a questionnaire of 120 questions, which I am personally aware of, and 59 initially out of which were banned, 54 of them chose not to reply. And what were the questions? Shareholding pattern. Does your director or significant shareholders or functionaries have a background with PLA or connects? And then going into the details of whether you have handed over data of Indian nationals to the Chinese government. 54 of them chose not to reply. UC News was asked, how many journalists are there on the payroll and how many of them have got journalistic degrees? They don't reply. They were asked whether you upload news yourself or is it done from China? They chose not to reply. So if 54 of them chose not to reply and then the government decided to move and make the ban permanent, how can you make that there was no judicial decision making? And second, Nidhi, as I pointed out, see, when Pranesh said that he doesn't remember that China has violated any of his rights, it's a sorry statement. They did violate your collective rights as a society and a nation multiple times, including the time when these apps were banned by killing your soldiers, grabbing your territories. And then if you compare US to China, this is a very sad story of our whole cybersecurity community that we can't compare apple to oranges. I 100% agree with Pranesh that US also does the surveillance. And the only solution is that indigenous solutions, in-house technologies. But you can't compare West with China because of the sheer political governance and the administrative model. In US, the Snowden, surveillance was happening under FISA Act. It was through a court order. People have gone on to file class action suits. There is a course correction which is happening. But in China, you don't need a court order. You need just a diktat from a private dictator or a communist party commissioner who is attached to a PLA, and you hand over data. Otherwise, you land up in jail.
Okay.
Take the example of Alibaba. The biggest IPO in the world is cancelled a day before, and the CEO disappears for 6 months. So there is no judicial forum you have to approach for. There is no course correction it can happen. That is why we must never compare China with US and Europe. I agree, US may be a threat, but it is not a security threat or a border threat, emerging threat today. In the long run, I agree with Ramesh with you. We need indigenous solution. Every technology is like a mirror. It is very beautiful when you have it. The moment you break it, it is the most dangerous weapon in the hand.
Okay,
But till the time it is broken, it is a mirror.
Okay, good to see healthy disagreement, even on a Zoom panel these days, and very different, refreshing perspectives. Trisha, in that context, in fact, between just what you've just heard, there's an interesting question from one of the attendees here, Dharmesh, who's asked that should India not take help from other developed countries like the US or even Japan in making our cybersecurity policy? What do you think?
Yeah, so this is a common refrain in cyberspace, right? That no one country can really solve these challenges on their own, and which is why India's engagement with international processes, multi-stakeholder or bilateral, or through this emerging partnership, which is the Quad, these are all important. The thing is, though, that over-reliance on some of these processes, there's an issue there, right? Because a lot of these multilateral processes are in gridlock because we live in an environment of increasing geopolitical tension. So you're not getting the kind of concrete norms and rules that you need to really make progress in cyberspace, which is not to say that we should stop dialogue entirely. There are important issues that are being discussed at these forums. For example, something as basic as what is sovereignty in cyberspace? Because cyberspace is borderless. So you can't use the traditional notion of territorial sovereignty, which is that everything based in your own territory is what's under your jurisdiction. Because cyberspace is borderless, because you also have actors like tech giants in terms of the kind of power they have, the kind of control over data flows they have, they are almost at par with states in that respect. And so, in fact, in India, the open-ended working group on cyber proposed this very interesting new framing for sovereignty, which is based on data ownership rather than territorial jurisdiction. So jurisdiction is based on who is generating the data as opposed to which server it ends up in. And you have a similar idea now emerging with the data empowerment and protection architecture that was proposed by Niti Aayog, which empowers users and gives them more power over where and how their data is used. So the DIPA framework would actually be very interesting in practice and would perhaps solve some of the contentious issues that we've been discussing at the panel.
I just then like to also get into this issue of detection, attribution, prosecution, and how there are obviously big challenges with that. Jitin, I'd like to ask you about that first. Because you deal with these issues closely. How difficult is it to track the bad guys and hold them accountable?
So detection itself is a huge challenge when it comes to any cyber threat, malware, or espionage. So you could say that chances of you detecting an attack before some damage is done is not even 1 out of 100, not even 1%. And in that 1%, the chances of you being able to attribute it successfully to a particular state or an entity is 5% in that 1%. So it's less than 0.001%. And prosecution, there has been no successful prosecution except a couple of examples from narco and this crypto ransomware guys who've been arrested in US and Europe. There is hardly any prosecution. And that is why countries like North Korea, China, Russia are having a free run, committing ransomware gangs, openly running malware campaigns, giving services like hackers on hire. And then you work with a state in that country and destroy the rest of the world, and you are safe and secure because nobody will come and pick you up. So I think detection, attribution, and prosecution, if you club all three of them together, then to book is not even like 0.001%. That is why preemptive measures like banning these apps or checking out Huawei is happening, because you very well know. And it's interesting to see Huawei even offered to share their source code with the governments at the cost of not banning them. They did it with the United Kingdom, where they set up a joint lab with the British government, funded it, saying that we will even give you the source code, but don't ban us. But then 3 years later, even GCHQ realized that, boss, what about the off-the-air updates? What about the capacity to detect if there is something which is like a 0-day where they were able to manipulate a particular code or create a new backdoor on the fly, which we are not able to detect. How do we take that risk? So that is why I think the cyber security is not about just securing a parameter. It is about going down in the territories, getting threat intelligence, taking the corrective and preemptive actions in time to ensure that you don't fall for it. And that is why I say that, when government ban the Chinese apps, probably in the hindsight, one could have many different views. But you must realize, if you don't ban these apps just because they are Chinese and you compare them to US, tomorrow somebody will wake up and say that, what about Pakistan? Why are you not allowing Pakistanis companies to set up shops here? Let's allow ISI, which manufacture Android tablets, to set up a factory here because they're also selling cheaper. So if we see Pakistan as an enemy today, then we are in that dilemma that half of the country thinks that China is a biggest trading partner and our future ally, and half of the nation thinks that these are the biggest emerging threat today on your border. So in that confused state of mind, I think whatever least we can do to avoid, threats which, are something which is irreversible, like your dependency of your entire telecom network on a Chinese company, which is working hand in hand with the Chinese Communist Party. If they were to carry out some sort of surveillance tomorrow, and even if you detect it, even if you figure it out, even if they admit it, doing away with that equipment, removing dependencies will just not be possible, at least for a year, and forget the cost calculations. So let us not create dependencies which are irreversible.
Like you said, you have to be preemptive. So let me just, this is the last round of questions. Pranesh Prakash, in terms of, I think it's clear that we have to be preemptive when it comes to these issues. What do you think those preemptive steps can possibly be, not just for governments now, but let's say companies, corporations, and individuals, who do face a threat on a daily basis?
So preemptive steps have to, one, have some kind of connection with the threat that you perceive. It's unclear to me, no one has ever explained why TikTok was a threat to, say, students in Belgaum, doing fancy dances and earning money from it, right? How was that in somehow a national security threat to India, requiring that not just TikTok, right? There were lots of apps. Now they didn't even respond. Maybe we didn't get the right email address. Who knows? That someone didn't respond to a questionnaire can't be seen as a reason to ban an app, especially when to ban an app, you need to clear both the hurdles set up by Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution, as well as the requirements of Section 69(a) itself. Which, in my opinion, weren't actually satisfied. So, the actions that we take, right, whether they're reactive or preemptive, have to have some kind of relationship to the perceived threat. And so, for instance, requiring all infrastructure providers to provide source code. Okay, now this is something that Cisco has been reluctant to do. Huawei, on the other hand, has been open to doing. And I believe the Indian government should force all infrastructure providers to provide source code. They should require system setup that you can actually match the source code to what's running on your operational systems. They should have, they should conduct their frameworks for testing of infrastructure for things such as passive listening, okay, to see whether things end up in parts of networks where they ought not be ending up, and to try and discover whether there are leaks. Now, India could be funding a lot of research on this front as well, which we don't seem to be doing. We could set up a proactive, policy which, lays out clearly what all we consider to be cyber threats, what kinds of incidents and episodes we consider to be cyber warfare. Right now, the Indian policy on these kinds of matters, when we react or when we may actually engage in attacking other countries' infrastructure and so on, that isn't clear at all. For instance, with nuclear weapons, we have a laid out policy with the no first use policy. With we don't have a cyber doctrine, okay, public cyber doctrine when it comes to these kinds of issues. Defense think tanks such as ITSA have been talking about the need for this for years, but the Indian government still hasn't actually put its pieces together to actually come out with a cyber doctrine. On the other hand, you see other kinds of countries, including those in Europe, actually coming together to develop cyber doctrine, collectively. NATO has been doing that publicly. What India's standards on many of these issues is not at all clear. So I think proactively on the policy front, there's lots we could be doing in terms of improving security itself. There's where do I start? So some year in 2010, I think it was, the Indian Express carried a very interesting piece. There had been research by folks in one of the Nordic countries. I'm not sure whether Sweden or Norway, I apologize, but they ran what are called exit nodes on the Tor network. This is an anonymizing network. They realized that lots of entities who are using the Tor network, including governments, including foreign missions, etc., actually weren't encrypting their traffic. So they contacted as many of these entities as they could. These were, white hat researchers, so-called, and one of the entities was the Indian ambassadors, the Indian ambassador in China. They eventually, after a few months, released all the passwords and so on that they'd logged. And the Indian Express reported that they could still, a few months after the embassy had been notified, they could still actually log into the ambassador's email account and go through his emails. Now that's shocking to me. Okay, now not a much bigger deal was made of it. That undersea cables in places like Bombay are being targeted both by NTRO as well as by US agencies, unnamed, okay, was actually revealed in 2010 in a series of reports in Outlook magazine. Okay, that didn't cause a stir. Okay, hardly anyone even knows that this was happening. It did cause a big stir when a similar report came out as part of the Snowden revelations. Okay, Indian newspapers made a big deal out of the fact that the US government was in places in New York and other places tapping into undersea cables, but the same thing's happening in India. Okay, so what kinds of issues, what kinds of whether attacks on personal integrity and privacy we tolerate, what kinds of surveillance we tolerate, and what kinds of steps we don't take. Simple things such as using HTTPS. And again, granted, this was back in 2010 or so, but even then, HTTPS was widely available and recommended for use in email. Okay, and at least for logging in through webmail, which is what the case was. So even if these kinds of simple steps we actually don't take, then all the rest, in terms of setting up thematic sectoral certs, ensuring higher levels of security all around in different industries, setting up bodies to coordinate this, funding all of this, it seems a far cry to me. Now, in some areas, such as banking, things are slowly improving, in my opinion. I think the RBI has been doing a much better job of it than many other sectors and many other regulators. But far, far more needs to be done. And I don't even know what effective first steps could be. But perhaps before all of this, we need a good, sound, cohesive, coherent, and public policy in the form of a national security policy and its revision, which has been going on for far too long. We need a revised policy for that.
Trisha Ray, would you say that, I think from what Pranesh was just saying, that 10 years ago, 12 years ago, these things were being reported and perhaps the media, the establishment were not taking the issues as seriously as they should have. Has that changed today? I mean, do you see a much bigger sort of concern? I do see the word cybersecurity, cooperation, these words pop up a lot more in sort of foreign policy documents now, summit level meetings, etc. but is there a sort of more urgent focus on this genuinely?
Oh, absolutely, there is. And part of that is because digitalization has become a lot more pervasive, right? It's part of our lives now, especially after the pandemic. Even organizations that were hesitant to digitalize or move their operations online had to do so. But they were also unprepared, right, for the environment. And hence you had this huge spike in ransomware and cyber attacks. I would say that since we're also talking about solutions and since we're in the last leg of the webinar, the app ban, I know we've had some differing viewpoints on it. It certainly got people to really care about where the apps are coming from and to care about where their data is going, right? So it triggered a conversation. So there is value in that as well. And I'll also say that at an individual level, there's value to cyber hygiene and digital skills. Like in many cases, a lot of these massive malware attacks and data breaches began by someone clicking a fishy link in an email. That's allegedly how the attack on the Kodunkulam nuclear plant was carried out, for example. So having individuals, employees of organizations really go through that training would be a small step with significant consequences. And then finally, because we're also talking about international partnerships, there's this growing lexicon of trusted partnerships, right? Which is something that Jiten also alluded to, right? Which is that there are certain countries which uphold values which share with, like rule of law, democracy, freedom, and so on. And so India has been ramping up its engagement with such partners through the quadrilateral security partnership, through the connectivity partnership with the European Union, for example, recently. So this is like another step from the individual to the multilateral level. These are some steps that we can take.
All right. Well, I would like to thank you all very much for this rather what turned out to be a far more animated conversation on cybersecurity than I had thought it would be. Very interesting, different perspectives, insights, and thank you for some of the ideas you've suggested in terms of solutions and what India needs to do. I hope we sort of walk away from this with a better understanding of the issues at hand. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nidhi, for hosting this wonderful conversation.
Very civilized.
Thanks, Pranesh. Thanks, Trisha.
Thanks, Nidhi.